Right, I'm going to be reading a little bit, chapter 9 from this book, which is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And it's Pete Walker's book, and it's work on the inner critic. And one of that we're going to do tonight, I'm going to read a little bit about the inner critic, because we need to slay it, so to speak, like we would slay a dragon, because a lot of people that have been through childhood trauma are repeating what they were taught through their adult life. So the only way around that is to become aware of the inner critic and the voice in our head that is telling us that we're worthless and that we're not worth anything. And it's very difficult for people that have had trauma in childhood, because it means that the voice that we play back as adults and we hear in our heads is not our voice. It's the voice that was given to us. Children, as we all know, we're all conditioned, and we basically are in a position where unless we begin to adult ourselves and get rid of this voice, then we're basically suffering and the trauma over and over again. So if you were told that you were worthless and that you weren't loved and you weren't nurtured, and that was shown to you either through words or treatment of, just general abuse, then it means that you're replaying it. So I'm going to read a little bit from here, and then I'll explain a bit about my own experience with the inner critic. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's called Shrinking the Inner Critic. Hello there, Ron Fan 69. I can see you there. Thanks for joining. Okay, Shrinking the Inner Critic. He says here, Pete Walker, he says, this chapter explores what one of my clients calls the nasty and sneaky tricks of the critic. Origin of the CPTSD critic. So this is the origins of it. A flashback-inducing critic is typically spawned in a danger-ridden childhood home. This is true whether the danger comes from the passive abandonment of neglect or the active abandonment of abuse. When parents do not provide safe enough bonding and positive feedback, the child flounders in anxiety and fear. Many children appear to be hardwired to adapt to this endangering abandonment with perfectionism. A prevailing climate of danger forces the child's superego to overcultivate the various programs of perfectionism and endangerment listed below. Once again, the superego is the part of the psyche that learns parental rules in order to gain their acceptance. So what that means, the superego, the ego gets a bad rap. The ego is basically the way we make choices and make decisions and how we get things done and we get what we want. We have to use that part of our brain in order to function in life. And I know in spirituality, everybody's going on about getting rid of your ego. If we did that, we wouldn't be going very far. There is no separation, so to speak, including in the brain. So what we have is that a voice in our heads, and I had it for years. One of the things that I used to replay was, what's wrong with you, child? So, or not, I didn't add the child bit to it, but I'd ask myself, what's wrong with me? And as a child, I was constantly asked, when I needed nurturing or love, I was asked, what's wrong with you, child? Like there was something wrong with me for having needs. Continuing reading. He says, the inner critic is the superego gone bad. The inner critic is the superego in overdrive, desperately trying to win your parents' approval. So if you can imagine that we've been through all of that abuse as a child, and then as an adult, we've got this behavior in us, which means that we're going to try and please everybody and try to be perfect. And that perfectionism or that inner critic voice means that we'll get into, if we go into relationships and people are not kind to us, then we won't stand up for ourselves. Our behavior is not, we've not been taught how to do that. The other thing is that the perfectionism means that maybe, you get involved in a relationship, or you're asked on a date, or you want to go to a job interview. But because you've got this perfectionist idea that people, that if you don't behave a particular way, people aren't going to like you, it means that you're not going to step forward in your life. So it stops you functioning in the world in a normal, healthy way. And if you look at children, they've got no idea, you know, when we're very little, we've got no idea about who we are, so we just act naturally. And when we've been through abuse, it means we end up with something called arrested development, which means that not all of our, you know, personality becomes split. It means we're not whole. So if somebody is abusive, we don't, you know, if we've been abused as a child and we've said no, 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 the abuser would generally knock that on the head and not allow us to say no. So it means as an adult, when we're in abusive situations, then we haven't got the ability to say no. So, and that also stops us hanging out with people because, you know, we feel safer when we're alone. So then he goes on, he says, when perfectionist striving fails to win welcoming your parents, the inner critic becomes increasingly hostile and caustic. It festers into a virulent inner voice that increasingly manifests self-hate, self-disgust, and self-abandonment. Let me see there. That's Ron Fan. You said the superego is what needs to be rid of, not the ego. It's not getting rid of it. It's more integrating it. So we can't get rid of something, like we can't get rid of that part of ourselves. Sometimes it's useful, the superego. It's like, you know, if we know we've got to clean up our, you know, wash our dishes or whatever, and this super ego will come in and, you know, as an example, I'm not saying exact, but as an example, Rumfam, you know, maybe, you know, we've got to get our taxes done, our paperwork, and that super ego can be really useful. Say, come on, like for me, it would be, come on, pen, you know, get your act together. So, you know, maybe a parent would say, come on, clean up your room. So there's a healthy, there's a healthy part of the super ego and there's an healthy part. It's like with narcissism, you know, as another example, there's healthy narcissism and there's unhealthy narcissism. Like it's quite healthy to be proud of yourself if you've, you know, achieved something, and also to care for yourself and stuff like that. So it's all these words, they're never all or nothing. Continuing reading. He says it festers into a virulent inner voice that increasingly manifests self-hate, self-disgust, and self-abandonment. The inner critic blames you incessantly for your shortcomings that it imagines to be the cause of your parents' rejection. So that voice in our heads that makes us feel like crap, excuse my language, that we fight with, you know, we might look in the mirror and think we're ugly. We might think, you know, just that we're not perfect enough or we're not good enough, or we might have a habit of, you know, saying sorry all of the time, as an example, you know, just for being alive. There's many things that happen when we have, you know, we've been through child abuse, and that we have to first begin to deal with the inner critic to get the other things under control. Because otherwise, you know, if we feel angry about something, for instance, of the past, then we go into toxic shame, and that's, you know, basically will stop us functioning in life as well. And he goes on, he says, it is incapable of understanding that the real cause lies in your parents' shortcomings. So if you imagine, if you weren't abused, then, you know, half the problems that abused people who've been abused wouldn't have had they not been through abuse. He says here, as a traumatized child, your over-aroused sympathetic nervous system also drives you to becoming increasingly hypervigilant. Hypervigilance is a fixation on looking for danger that comes from excessive exposure to real danger. In an effort to recognize, predict, and avoid danger, hypervigilance is ingrained in your approach to being in the world. Hypervigilance narrows your attention into an incessant on-guard scanning of the people around you. It also frequently projects into the future, imagining danger in upcoming social events. Moreover, hypervigilance typically devolves into intense performance anxiety on every level of self-expression. Like the soldier overlong in combat, PTSD sets in because you feel as if you are constantly under attack. Unfortunately, internal attack is now added to external attack, and become locked into hypervigilance and the sympathetic nervous system arousal. So the parasympathetic nervous system is when you're relaxed, like if you've had a meal, like a large meal, and you sit back and you're relaxed, you're in the parasympathetic. With the sympathetic nervous system, you basically you're freaked out. And this leads into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, which is also mentioned in the book. He says here, a traumatized child becomes desperate to relieve the anxiety and depression of abandonment. The critic-driven child can only think about the ways she is too much or not enough. And I found that doing that with myself, I'd believe that I was too much for people or not enough for people. I don't know if anybody relates to that listening to this, that you're your worst judge and your worst critic. And you've got no no self-love as well. It's like you're just hammering yourself with, just unkind thoughts and these are not ours. They were given to us. So we've got to begin to listen to that voice. When I first started listening to that voice, based on Pete Walker's book about 1.5 years ago, I was horrified at the way I was speaking to myself and the way I talked to myself. And that's going to be inner child work as well, which was very difficult for me to embrace, the inner child, because there was a hatred for my inner child, not because I hated my inner child, but because I didn't want to relate back to those moments that were so harrowing for me, that I had no connection with this inner child. It's like I'd always been a little adult because I had all of these adult things thrown at me that I had to deal with, and it meant that there was no childhood. So behaviors to unlearn and decondition what we've been taught takes psychoeducation. And for me, I've going to therapy as well. I've been doing therapy since last September, once a week, trauma psychoanalysis, and that's helped me to, as part of Pete Walker's work, it's helped me to evolve and understand a lot of the depths of my own pain and sit with my pain and stop disassociating and pretending that it was okay. The other thing this book helped me to do, I suffered a lot of guilt because I really believed that I was a bad person because I couldn't forgive my parents for the childhood I had. And it's very difficult when people don't know what you've been through, the worst of the worst, and people are saying, your friends are saying to you, oh, you've got to forgive them because they're your parents. It's not about unforgiveness so much as that, it's a very difficult thing to pull off when you've not processed the original pain. And the pain that you've been through, if it's never been acknowledged, it's in you, and you've got all of this hypervigilance, flashbacks, nightmares, not being able to get on with your life, not being able to have healthy relationships, abandoning yourself, depression, hating your body. It's just huge. And the mess that's in this world. Pete Walker says in this book, there's 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys that have been through sexual abuse, violence, and emotional abuse and physical abuse. So that's very much, I would say, about half the population of planet Earth, of 7.5 billion of us. And this stuff really isn't spoken about out there. It's like people are expected to get on with it. If you'd been through the war, and this is not, this is just an example. I'm not saying anything, but PTSD is well known with soldiers. It used to be called shell shock years ago, but not enough people are aware of the real trauma that's carried with people in adulthood that have been through childhood trauma. And I'm very pleased in the news now, the last couple of years, like with the Catholic Church being called out, Hollywood being called out, it's helping resolve this issue where people are, people are now aware, not all people, but many people are, that if they are going to abuse, I don't know how people do abuse, to be honest with you. I don't know how people do that to children, but they do. So, but at least because it's being aired publicly, and people are being called out on abuse, it means that people will, slowly, consciousness is changing. And we've got a long way to go, clearly. But we're part of that, us that have been through it, who are prepared to speak up and talk about this stuff and have no shame about it and do it gracefully as well. We can do this gracefully. It means that we're going to be helping other people. and not only ourselves. And I found that my best healing has been coming through also helping others. So then he goes on to say, a traumatized child becomes desperate to relieve the anxiety and depression of abandonment. The critic-driven child can only think about the ways she is too much or not enough. The child's unfolding sense of self, the healthy ego, finds no room to develop. Her identity virtually becomes the critic. So if you think, if that identity is the critic, 24/7, then it's not surprising that people do disassociate, for me, it was with alcohol and cigarettes for years and recreational drugs before that. But I was a late starter in that, with alcohol at really 30, that was when everything went pear-shaped for me on, using those things. And it was a coping mechanism, like a crutch to, so I didn't have to have nightmares and flashbacks. And, it was like party time. But then eventually the alcohol doesn't work. You come back to yourself. And it was only when I stopped alcohol that all of these things started coming up. In 2012, I stopped drinking, and all of the memories started coming to the surface, and I started going into deep anxiety and panic attacks. And it's been a long road out of that. But doing the work is beautiful, because where I'm at today means that I'm able to speak to people, and I know, what I need to be okay in myself, and I can voice that with no shame. Going on, he says, in this process, the critic becomes increasingly virulent and eventually switches from the parent's internalized voice, you're a bad boy, girl, in the first person. So you say it to yourself, there's something wrong with me. I'm a bad boy, girl. Over time, self-goading increases and deteriorates to, I'm such a loser, I'm so pathetic, bad, ugly, worthless, stupid, defective. And I don't know if any of you guys relate to what I'm saying there, but I lived that way for many, many of my years. And, I'm grateful. I am grateful that I'm out of that bit. But, without this book and without groups on Facebook and being able to express, I don't know where I'd be. Because there is very little real help in the real world. There's a lot of people being, sort of on the news where you see these Catholic priests and whatever arrested or whatever. But what happens to all of these people who've been through it, after the event of these reports? It's deep work to do. So I'm going to keep reading. He says, this is unlike the soldiers in combat who does not develop a toxic critic. That's interesting. So he's saying that, but then maybe somebody could, I don't know, because I'm thinking about that. This is unlike the soldier in combat who does not develop a toxic critic. I mean, I think it would be possible that if you were in war, somehow I'm thinking to develop a toxic critic, depending on the circumstances, reading that bit. This process whereby the superego becomes a carcinogenic is a key juncture where PTSD morphs into CPTSD. The cruel, totalitarian inner critic is a key distinguishing feature of CPTSD. So Pete Walker's saying that the inner critic is the key distinguishing feature of the CPTSD response. So make it clear that CPTSD is a response to events throughout your childhood life and not a disorder. And there are many people that I've seen in groups on Facebook, saying they are this or they're that, or, labeling what they are. And I don't know how people can label what they are without having, proper brain scans or, tests to see where their chemicals are at. I don't know how this works, but it just seems that we need to be easier on ourselves and stop labeling ourselves and start looking at the real issue, which is the lack of nurturing love, the lack of grieving that's gone on, the lack of healthy blame, and the lack of, it's not lack for us, but that we've not been able to do that we've not been able to have healthy blame or healthy anger because society is not set up to, hear it. So as an example, if you say to somebody, I'm really hurt that my parents abused me and I want nothing to do with them, then friends will often say, oh, but they're your parents, you have to forgive them. And it's just a cop-out. But clearly, if people haven't been through abuse, then they're not going to know what you're referring to. So it just seems these one-liners float about in spiritual circles and religious circles as well. Like the famous one is, honor thy mother and father as an example. But, we have to think for ourselves and decide what's right for us and not be triggered by people. If that's a trigger for you and somebody says that to you, then you've got to know that it's okay to ask people, hey, please don't say that to me. And if they don't listen to you, they're not your friend. It's like, move on. That's my advice, because I wasted quite a few years. You don't need to convince anybody of what's right for you. What's right for you is right for you. We're all individuals as snowflakes. I study astrology, and if you look at an astrology chart, every single person's astrology chart is different. Somebody would have to be born at exactly the same moment in the same place in order to have exactly the same astrology chart. We are completely unique. Pete Walker goes on. He says, one of my clients griefully remembered the constant refrains of his childhood. If only I wasn't so needy and selfish. If only my freckles would fade. If only I could pitch a perfect game. If only I could stop gagging on the canned peas during dinner. If only I could pray all the time to get mum's arthritis cured. Then maybe she'd stop picking on me, and then maybe dad would play catch with me. So children will blame themselves. And I remember blaming myself, if there were fights or violence going on at home, I would think that it had something to do with me as a child. Going on. He says, in my work with survivors, and I will say with the word survivors, we can choose our own words. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm just a being, and I've lived it, and I've lived this, and I've come out the other end of it. So we can call ourselves what we want. That's not a word I would choose for myself, but some people might like to call themselves a survivor. He says, I am constantly struck by how often the inner critic triggers them into overwhelming emotional flashbacks. So an emotional flashback will send you into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And below this video, you're going to have the 13 steps for managing flashbacks and 14 tips for dealing with your inner critics. So you can go below and print those off. And then you can get this book for free on Amazon at the moment as well. Continuing, he says, the CPTSD-derived inner critic weds our fear of abandonment to our self-hate about our imperfections. It then tortures us with the entwined serpents of perfectionism and the endangerment. He says, endangerment is the process of constantly projecting danger onto safe enough situations. Your recovering depends on learning how to recognize and confront the 14 inner critic attacks listed below. So the good news is I've put this below in this video, the link for those 14 inner critic attacks. So you print a copy of that off and you carry it with you and get used to it. Read it before you go to sleep at night. Then he says, when this process of recovering is bypassed, these deeply ingrained programs continue to send you tumbling back into the overwhelming fear, shame, hopelessness of your childhood abandonment. So what I'm telling you is the inner critic, we have to understand it. So if you go print that off, and then I've got a ladies group, for the ladies, I have a ladies group over on Facebook, which you can join. For the guys, I know a few groups where there's anxiety, PTSD that I can point you to if you private message me. And on social media, you don't have to do it here. And begin that work, because for me now, if my inner critic says something, I knock it out of the way. I do not tolerate. I can get a bit sad. I might look at myself and think, oh, I don't look that good today, or something about me, or I haven't done something correctly. I knock it out of the way immediately. I do not let it. And I get angry because I know where that inner critic came from. We're absolutely magnificent. We've got, you know, whatever you believe in, God or whatever God is to you, you know, there's so much power in being human that we are absolutely can get past this, and we can go to another level in our healing. And it's not all or nothing. You have, you know, for me, I have good days and bad days. I have tearful days and I have days of laughter. Sometimes I have both. I have tears and laughter on the same day or within hours sometimes. So we have to be gentle and know that we're not going to be healed. You know, that word like, I'm going to be healed one day. It's not, we're human. We don't know what's going to trigger us. So it's a learning curve, but not berating ourselves thinking that we need to be fully healed. Whole, and Carl Gustav Jung would say that the purpose is to become whole. But the beautiful thing about becoming whole, like whole as a person, is that we're forever becoming whole all the way through. Ron Fan says, PTSD is very distinct from complex PTSD. One is a response to an actually life-threatening, and the other one primary caregivers who is one is dependent. Yes, and that's the thing, you know, babies are dependent. I mean, how hard can we be on ourselves? You know, we were dependent upon our parents for love and nurture. And if we're shunned, it messes with life. It's very messy to decondition all of that. And that's what we've got to do, you know, as we've got to adult ourselves and start deconditioning. So, you know, for me, if I was just going to therapy as an example, and I wasn't doing the inner critic work, and I wasn't reading Pete Walker, I wouldn't know, you know, it wouldn't be enough. It's like we have to go at it from different angles and different ends. The other book I'm reading, which is stunning, it's called Trauma and the Soul. And this gentleman, Donald Cowshed, is a Jungian therapist. So this is to do with Carl Jung's work. And what you might see here, and I don't know if you can see this here, there's a picture, this beautiful picture where you've got the good angel and the evil angel and the baby in between. And it's a beautiful, stunning depiction of, you know, what it's like that inner critic. It's like trying to pull us. It's our inner world trying to pull us one way and then the other way. So we can do this stuff, okay? And I just, if anybody's out there and they want to send me an email, then please do that. And I'll be back with more tomorrow. And I really thank you, whoever's watching there. I really thank you for being here and listening. And Romfan, thank you for your comments. Really great that you've, it's great chatting with me as well. You know, it's nice to see what other people's thoughts are as well. Have a really good night. And it's late here in London. It's way after midnight. Not way, but getting there. I'll catch you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.